Hi, my name is Bruno Morlin, and I teach AP African American Studies. And in this series, I'm going to go over all the required sources in the AP African American Studies curriculum. Today, we're looking at Unit Topic 2.6, Labor, Culture, and Economy. What this unit's topic is trying to go over is exactly the different types of work and what the work life was for enslaved people in the 16, 17, and 1800s. We'll start by looking at an image of an 1823 sugarcane harvest from the West Indies, and specifically in Antigua. The painting shows what's called a gang system of enslaved workers taking down sugarcane at the end of the growing season. That sugarcane is then going to be milled and refined into sugar that would then be sold to other European countries. The Portuguese and the Spanish first set up sugarcane plantations off the coast of Africa in Cabo Verde and Sao Tome. It was in these two islands that they set the model for what a sugarcane plantation should look like, and then that model was exported to the West Indies and Brazil. Sugar was an extremely lucrative crop for those who grew it, and it was extremely labor-intensive and dangerous for the people who had to do it. The division of labor on sugarcane plantations was very acutely defined. There were people who only worked on growing the sugarcane and then later cutting it down. There were those people that worked in the mill and in the refining process. And some historians have pointed to this division of labor for a framework of what will later be used in the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. What we're seeing in this image is that the enslaved workers are working in what's called the gang systems. There's an overseer that tells them when to start working, how fast to work, and if there's anyone that falls behind in the pace of work that they've set, they would be open to physical punishment. This type of labor system could have been extremely brutal, especially if a worker was unable to keep up with the pace demanded by the overseer. Overseers could be white men who worked for the landowner, or they could also be trusted enslaved men. What is a little less clear to see in the image is the actual conditions of what it was like in sugarcane plantations. Sugar mostly grew in areas that had really hot and humid climates, and doing a lot of work in these types of conditions would have opened people up to things like heat stroke and dehydration. There were also other perils like mosquito-borne viruses in these areas. So it's no wonder that enslaved people who arrived in the West Indies had an average lifespan of 5 years after their arrival. Something else that is not easily seen in this image is what the enslaved people could have done to resist the pace of the overseer. Oftentimes during the gang system, the enslaved workers would sing a song and then they would work at the pace of the song that they were singing. So to deliberately try to slow down the pace of work, they would sing a song with a slower tempo. We'll see in a later unit's topic how these songs had African influences, and they were also meshed with Christian hymns that were introduced to them by their enslavers, were used as other forms of resistance. The gang system contrasts greatly with the task system. That was the other popular system of work that was put in place into other plantations. In the task system, enslaved people were responsible to fulfill a quota for the day, and then they would have the rest of the day to go back to their quarters or grow their own food. While this may seem like a better situation, because they had more time on their hands, they were also expected to be more responsible for their own sustenance. That means that they had to grow their own food to supplement the food that was given to them by their enslavers. I do want to be clear that neither of these forms of slavery were preferable. Both systems were extremely oppressive, and enslaved people in both systems were always at danger or risk of physical harm. The second required source for this topic is a broadside or an advertisement for a slave auction that happens in New Orleans in 1859. There's a description of 20 enslaved people that will be up for auction, and as you can see, the top 4 people on this list have a longer description of what their skills are. You'll notice a pattern that in the eyes of the auctioneers, these are the most valuable enslaved people and will garner a higher paying price. The trend continues all the way down to the bottom, as other enslaved people are described in more general terms, and at the very bottom there's a statement that there are other general field hands also available for sale. This term field hand was a general term that was used for anyone that worked on a plantation. They didn't have any special skills like the engineers or the masons that were listed up at the top. And for that reason, they were seen as more expendable or less valuable than others. Those that are described as field hands in this advertisement are usually young men. who would likely be strong workers in the fields. As you go down, you'll see that the women are listed next, and most of the skills that are listed alongside them are domestic duties like washing, ironing, and cooking. You'll see that the descriptor word likely is something that continues to come up to describe a lot of women. In this case, the use of the word likely wasn't necessarily meant to describe someone who would be sexually exploited. In this case, the word was usually paired with others like strong or healthy or desirable. There are some cultural elements that I want to point out here. For one, there is a young girl that's listed as being able to speak both English and French. This would be a remnant of the French population that originally colonized the region that later became Louisiana and New Orleans. The other cultural elements that we see is the use of the word mulatto. This refers to someone who is half black and half white. The word has its origin from Spanish colonization when they initially created their castas or castes. Lastly, you'll see the word grif. That is used to refer to someone who's 3/4 black and 1/4 Native American. Up until the 1830s, most of the southeast of what is now the United States was primarily inhabited by Native Americans. They were removed by the Indian Removal Act that was signed by Andrew Jackson and later enforced under President Van Buren. And as you can see through this advertisement, their influence and presence in the region was not entirely gone as a result of the Indian removal. And as we go all the way down to the end of the advertisement, I'll point out again that there are several other plantation hands for sale. And they are much less noteworthy in the eyes of the auctioneer that there are no descriptors included in the advertisement for these people. And that's the final reminder that I'd like to leave you with for this document, that everyone who was listed here was a person. They all had families, they all had their own identities, and unfortunately, for most of them, the only thing that is left of them in the historical record is a descriptive word about how they were viewed by those people that exploited them. Final required source is a photograph of a rice fanner basket. Now, to get into this document, I want to provide some context and tell you that there were two different regions of the world that independently cultivated rice. The first was in China along the Yangtze River Valley about 9,000 years ago, and the other independently cultivated rice around the Niger River Delta about 3,000 years ago. So that means that rice as a crop was not indigenous to North America. In fact, indigenous people in North America practiced what was called Three Sisters farming, where they would grow corn, squash, and beans all on the same plots of land. European colonizers brought the Asian variety of rice to North America to try and grow and export commercially. In order to cultivate it, they sought enslaved workers who were familiar with the cultivation of rice. Therefore, they put a premium on enslaved people that came from the west coast of Africa who had previously done this. The South Carolina Low Country was geographically a favorable spot to do this because of its low and swampy land. Enslaved people from West Africa who had experienced growing rice end up using the same practices that they did in West Africa, now in the Carolina Low Country. Cultivation of rice in this new region was a lot more dangerous, again because of the swampy conditions that were a breeding ground for mosquitoes and mosquito-borne viruses. Rice grew to be the greatest export crop in all of the Carolinas, sometimes being referred to as Carolina gold. Now, just because the Europeans brought the Asian variety of rice for their commercial exports doesn't mean that the African variety of rice wasn't brought to North America. Some enslaved Africans were able to hide the seeds in the hair and then later cultivate it once they got to North America. However, the commercially exported variety was the Asian variety. So then that begs the question, who was buying this rice? Who was consuming it? Most of the rice that was grown in the Carolinas did end up going back to European purchasers. Countries like Spain and Portugal ended up buying a lot of it. But over time, a growing amount of those exports started to go to the West Indies. By 1760, as much as 20% of the rice that was grown in the Carolina regions was going to those islands to feed the enslaved people that were working on sugarcane plantations. That is to say that this enterprise that enslaved and exploited people in the Carolinas was used to sustain another enterprise that enslaved and exploited people in the West Indies. So those are all the required sources for this unit's topic. Please let me know if you found them interesting down in the comments. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.